she had pressed that silk 100 times before she ever wore it. Bobby Jo Whitfield spent 4 years inside the Kang estate. She knew which floorboards creaked. She knew which teacup the matriarch chose every morning. She had cleaned the halls, managed the staff, organized the ceremonies. Invisible in the way that every woman who works too hard and is noticed too little eventually becomes invisible. And then one day, Kang Min-woo, the man they called the Silk Thread, head of one of the most powerful criminal families in South Korea, looked at her across a kitchen table at midnight and asked about her mother in Atlanta. Not as small talk, as a real question. 2 years later, he put a ring on her finger. He also put a white and pale blue handbok on her bed with a note that said, "Wear this, not because they expect it, because I want you to." So Bobby Jo Whitfield, a black woman, honey-toned skin, blonde hair pressed smooth and pinned back, walked into the main hall of the Kang estate in traditional Korean silk in front of 12 people who had decided, long before she opened the door, what they thought of her. For 2 seconds, the room was almost beautiful. Then, the matriarch set down her chopsticks, and in the silence of that room, Madam Kang Soon-hee looked at Bobby Jo, first in Korean, then in English, so that no one would miss it, and said, "Dark skin disgraces this handbok." What happened next is not what anyone in that room expected, and what Kang Min-woo did after that, what he commissioned, what he discovered, and what he made his mother face in front of every person she had ever tried to impress, is a story about what happens when a man with power decides to use every last piece of it on behalf of the woman they told him he should be ashamed of. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. She had steamed that handbok 3 times before she ever touched it. The white silk georgette with pale blue trim had belonged to Madame Kang's sister, in-law, packed away in a cedar chest on the 3rd floor for 11 years. Bobby Jo Whitfield had found it during the annual inventory of the estate's formal wardrobe, noted it in the ledger, had it dry cleaned and returned to its chest before anyone asked. She had handled it the way she handled everything in that house. Carefully, thoroughly, without leaving a trace of herself on it. That was the job. 4 years of it. She had started at the Kang estate at 23, hired through a household staffing agency as a live-in housekeeper. Within 8 months, she was managing the domestic staff. Within 2 years, she had reorganized the ceremony preparation calendar, hired a new head cook, and renegotiated the catering contracts for the family's formal dinners. She was good at her work the way people are good at things they learned to survive on, completely. Without thinking about stopping, she knew the house better than most of the family did. She knew which hallway smelled of cedarwood after rain. She knew which light in the east wing flickered in cold weather, and which the electrician had been called to fix 4 separate times. She knew that Madame Kang always chose the white teacup with the gold rim at breakfast, and that she never finished the last sip. She knew all of this the way people know things they were never supposed to be asked about. On the evening before the first family dinner as Min-woo's fiancé, Bobby Jo stood in the dressing room he had given her, a room she had once cleaned, whose windows she had once wiped from the outside on a stepladder in October, and held the handbok in both hands. He had bought it for her 3 weeks after the engagement. White silk chima that pooled like still water, pale blue jeogori with embroidery at the cuffs, small flowers, precise stitching, the kind that took time. He had left it on the bed with a single note. "Wear this. Not because they'll expect it, because I want you to." She turned it in the light. She had pressed these garments for women this family considered worthy. She had hung them on padded forms, smoothed their collars, noted if a seam needed reinforcing. She had never been handed one to put on her own body. Bobby Joe set the handbok down on the bed, went to the window, and looked at the garden below. The persimmon tree in the east corner was still bearing fruit in the October cold. She had planted a cutting of it herself 2 winters ago, when the original tree died, and the head gardener didn't have a replacement species. She had researched the variety, ordered it from a nursery outside Jeonju, and planted it on a Thursday morning, before anyone was awake. No one had ever asked her where the tree came from. She went back to the handbok, put it on, stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She looked, she thought, like someone crossing a threshold they were not entirely sure existed yet. The main hall of the Kang estate seated 14. On that evening it held 12. Min Woo at the head, Madame Ke Soon Hee at his right, 3 of the family elders with their wives, 2 senior executives from Kang Holdings, and Raymond Cho at the far end, positioned near the door in the precise way he always positioned himself near doors. Candles burned in the iron chandelier. The lacquered table reflected them back as small orange flames duplicated in black mirror. Bobby Joe entered from the hall. She did not rush. She had learned a long time ago that hurrying into a room gives people permission to see you as someone out of place. She walked the way she always walked. Shoulders back, chin level, the pale blue silk moving against the floor with a sound like water. Minwoo stood up. It was not theatrical. It was not performed. He simply rose from his chair the moment he saw her, the way a person rises when something demands it of them. The koi tattoo on the left side of his neck was visible above his collar. His eyes did not move from her. For 2 seconds, the room was almost something it had never been. Then, Madame Kang set her chopsticks on the table. The sound was small. In the silence, it was enormous. She looked at Bobby Joe the way someone looks at a calculation they have already run and already know the answer to. Her dove-gray handbok was immaculate. Her jade pendant sat below her collarbone. Her face was composed and unhurried. Dark skin disgraces this handbok. She said it in Korean first, then she said it in English. Clearly, without raising her voice, as though she were noting something factual about the weather outside. The room did not move. Bobby Joe's right hand found the fabric of her chima and held it. Not gripping, just holding, the way you hold on to something when you need to remind yourself it is real. The pale blue silk was cool under her fingers. She had seen this room 1,000 times. She had set every plate on this table. She had arranged every centerpiece in this chandelier's light. She had never stood at the center of it before. Madame Kang continued. The hanbok carried generations, she said. It was not meant to be worn as decoration by someone who had forgotten where she came from. The words were measured and specific, and they landed with the precision of someone who had chosen them in advance. Minwoo had not sat back down. He stood at the head of the table, with both hands resting on the lacquer, very still, with the particular stillness that people who knew him understood as something other than calm. Bobby Joe looked at Madame Kang. Then she said, quietly, I wore it because the man I love asked me to, not to take something that isn't mine. To show up in the family I hoped would one day be mine. It was a true sentence. It landed like one. Madame Kang's eyes shifted. A small movement, very controlled, to her son, and Minwoo looked back at her and said nothing. He didn't have to. Minwoo did not apologize. That was the first thing Bobby Joe noticed when he came to her room that night. He knocked. One knock, quiet, and waited for her to open the door, which she did. He looked at her for a moment in the hallway light. She was still wearing the handbok. She hadn't taken it off. He stepped inside. He did not sit. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. She looked at him. "No." He nodded once, like that was all he needed. He didn't say sorry for what his mother had said, because sorry would have meant he hadn't expected it. And they both knew he had. He didn't promise that it would get easier, because that was not a promise he could guarantee. He didn't tell her she was beautiful, which she was, or that she was strong, which she also was, because those were the things people say when they don't know what else to offer. What he said was, "I'm going to Park Ji-young's studio tomorrow morning." Bobby Jo was quiet. She knew the name. Everyone who had worked in the Kang house knew Park Ji-young. The seamstress had been dressing the Kang women for 40 years. She had made Madame Kang's wedding hanbok. She had made the formal dress worn at every ancestral ceremony the family had held in living memory. "What are you commissioning?" Bobby Jo asked. "Yours," Minwoo said. She looked at the pale blue chima, still moving softly against her ankles. She started to say something about how that was too much. He looked at her in a way that said he was not asking. "You're coming to the studio," he said. "You're choosing the details." That was what no one expected. Not the gold, that was his declaration, but that she would make choices inside it. That her hand would be in the cloth before it was on her body. Park Ji-young's studio was in the older part of the city, in a building that had survived 4 decades of urban reconstruction by being too stubborn to come down. The front room smelled of cedar and sizing starch. Bolts of silk stood against the wall like standing soldiers. Cream, burgundy, deep blue, a green so dark it looked almost black. The seamstress received Minwoo with the measured courtesy she extended to all her clients, and with no particular deference, which was how Bobby Jo knew immediately that this was a woman who had no need to perform. When she turned to Bobby Jo, she looked at her the way she would look at a length of fabric. Not unkindly, but with the full attention of someone whose entire profession depended on seeing exactly what was in front of her. Minwoo explained what he wanted. The seamstress listened. When he finished, she picked up a pencil, opened a ledger, and began to write. She asked Bobby Jo nothing that first day. She only watched. The second visit, she brought out reference panels of embroidery. She laid them on the table, traditional motifs, historical patterns, variations by region and era. She told Bobby Jo to indicate what she was drawn to. Not what she thought was correct, not what she believed she had permission to choose. What she was drawn to. Bobby Jo moved through the panels slowly. She paused at a flower design, a particular bloom she recognized without knowing its name, because it grew in her mother's yard in Atlanta and bloomed every April without fail. She paused at a wave pattern that moved through the fabric like something that had crossed a long distance to arrive. She paused at a small design, 2 hands barely indicated, the fingers just meeting at the center. She chose them all. The flower, the wave, the hands. She explained none of them. The seamstress wrote them down. On the third visit, Park Ji-young brought out a book. It was old, bound in dark cloth, the pages thick and yellowed. A documentation of traditional Korean ceremonial textiles. She opened it to a page near the middle, smoothed it flat with her palm, and turned it toward Bobby Jo. Bobby Jo looked at the illustration. It was a hanbok embroidery pattern, wave and clasped hands, rendered in fine line. The caption beneath was in Korean, which Bobby Jo could not read. Park Ji-young read it aloud, then translated. The pattern, she explained, had historically been used on the garments of women entering new families after surviving a period of profound loss. Women who carried what the tradition called bridge weight, the spiritual capacity to hold 2 worlds in one body without letting either collapse. The pattern was considered an honorific, a recognition. It had not been in common use for 3 generations. Bobby Joe looked at the illustration for a long time, the flower she had chosen because it grew in her mother's yard, the wave because she had crossed distances she could not name, the hands because that was what she hoped for, to be held and never asked to let go. She had not known any of this. She had simply chosen what was true. Park Ji-young closed the book carefully. Then she said, without looking up, Madame Kang's grandmother wore a version of this at her remarriage after the war. I made the documentation myself. The studio was very quiet. Does Minwoo know? Bobby Joe asked. Not yet, the seamstress said. She looked at Bobby Joe over the rim of her silver glasses. I thought you should know first. Bobby Joe sat very still in the wooden chair by the fabric table. Outside, the city moved past the old windows. Inside, something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but the way a key turns in a lock it was always meant to open. She had walked into this house as a woman they called other. She had reached for a tradition, she was told. She had no right to touch, and the tradition itself had reached back and said, "We know you. We have always known women like you. You are not foreign to us. You are exactly what we were made to honor." Park Ji-young picked up her needle. Bobby Joe looked down at her own hands. She didn't ask what came next. She already knew. The gold handbok was 3 days from finished. When Madame Kang called her son into her study, Bobby Joe was in the east corridor. When she heard the door close, she wasn't listening. She was carrying fresh linens to the guest suite. A habit she had never fully stopped, that particular impulse to be useful in the rooms she had once been responsible for. She set the linens down on the hallway table and stood still. The study walls were thick, but the acoustics of that corridor carried sound through in fragments. Not words, not complete sentences, but enough. Her own name, more than once. She went to the window at the end of the hall and looked at the persimmon tree. Still bearing fruit, still standing in the cold. Minwoo came to find her 20 minutes later. He looked the way he looked when he had contained something that required containing. Jaw set, eyes quiet, one hand in his jacket pocket. She knows about the handbok, he said. Bobby Joe nodded. It had never been a secret. He looked at the window. She went further than I expected. She waited. She threatened to trigger a governance review of Kang Holdings. He said it the same way he said most things. Evenly, like a fact that had already been filed. If I don't end the engagement, she'll formally request one through the family elders. It would bring in outside auditors. Bobby Joe understood what that meant. She had lived in this house for 4 years. She knew what Kang Holdings held underneath its public face. An outside audit wasn't just paperwork. It was exposure. It was liability. It was the kind of structural damage that didn't fully heal. Can she do that? She asked. Technically, yes. He paused. The elders would have to support it. They will. Bobby Joe turned from the window and looked at him. He was looking at the persimmon tree, now. She thought about all the things she could say, that she would understand if he needed to protect the organization. That she had known, from the very beginning, that walking into this house as his fiancée would cost something, that she had no interest in being the reason. His entire world cracked at the foundation. She thought about the way he had stood up from the table when she walked into the room in the pale blue handbok. Not for show, not for performance. The involuntary, unrepeatable way a person rises when something matters. She thought about the book in Park Ji-young's studio and the pattern she had chosen without knowing what it meant. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I haven't decided," he said. Then he looked at her directly. "I wanted you to know first." She nodded. He left. Bobby Joe sat in the corridor for a long time after he was gone. She didn't cry. She had not cried at the dinner either, when Madame Kang's words had landed in front of 12 people like something she was supposed to absorb quietly and without spectacle. She had not cried then. She didn't now. But she felt something shift in her chest, a slow, grinding recalculation. Like a ship adjusting its weight. She had known this was possible. She had known it since the first time Minwoo looked at her in this house with something other than professional regard 2 years ago in the kitchen. After the elders' winter dinner, when everyone else had gone to bed and she was finishing the inventory, he had sat down across the table from her and asked her about her family in Atlanta. Not as small talk, but as a genuine question, the kind that expected a real answer. She had answered. He had listened. She had known then that this would eventually cost something enormous. She had chosen him anyway. Now she sat in the hallway of the house she had managed for 4 years, and she thought, what if choosing him destroys him? What if the price isn't what she was willing to pay, but what he would pay on her behalf? She thought about leaving. She turned it over slowly, the way you turn over a decision you don't want to make but feel you owe yourself the honesty of considering. She could go. She could remove herself from the equation. Let the governance threat dissolve. Let Madame Kang have what she wanted. She could disappear from this house the way she had always moved through it. Quietly, without leaving a trace. The persimmon tree was visible through the window at the end of the hall. The one she had planted. The one no one had ever asked about. She looked at it for a long time. Then she thought about Park Ji-young's studio, and the old book and the pattern on the yellowed page. She thought about the flower from her mother's orchard, and the wave, and the 2 hands barely touching. She thought about a seamstress who had dressed this family for 40 years looking at her over silver kit-rimmed glasses and saying, I thought you should know first. She had not chosen this story to leave it. She had not planted that tree to watch someone else stand in its shade. She went back to her room. She did not take anything out of the closet. She did not count her savings or look at agency listings or think about what came after. She sat on the edge of the bed and she waited, and she did not go anywhere. That was the decision. Small, not heroic, not dramatic, just the decision to remain in a place that had tried to make her feel like a guest in her own life. She stayed, and 3 floors down, in a study that smelled of old paper and cold tea, Madame Kang sat at her desk and sharpened the next move. She did not know yet that the board had already changed. She did not know yet that the seamstress had already made a call. Park Ji-young called Min Woo. The evening the governance threat was made. He had not told the seamstress. She had heard through the kind of network that old women who have dressed powerful families for 40 years inevitably build. The particular intelligence of people who are always in the room and never considered a participant. She had heard, and she had made 3 phone calls before she called him. She told him plainly that she had spoken to Elder Choi, Elder Nam, and Elder Sung. She had shown them the textile documentation. She had shown them the photograph she had taken of the pattern Bobby Joe selected, and the reference page from her archive, proving the motif's lineage. She had explained, in the language that men of their generation understood, the language of tradition, precedence, historical weight, that what Bobby Joe had chosen was not an act of appropriation. It was an act of recognition, an instinctive alignment with the family's own ancestral pattern of honoring women who survived and endured, and entered new histories with dignity, intact. The 3 elders, she told Minwoo, would not support the governance review. They found the matriarch's original public statement at the first dinner beneath the family's dignity. they were not prepared to compound it by granting her a procedural weapon. Minwoo was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do it for you. I did it 'cause it was true," she hung up. The gold handbok was finished on a Thursday morning. Bobby Joe went to collect it alone. Park Ji-young brought it out, folded in white tissue, in a lacquered box. She set the box on the work table and opened it without ceremony, the way she opened everything. With the steady hands of someone who had spent a lifetime handling things that mattered. The gold brocade caught the light from the studio windows and held it. Not as reflection, but as absorption, the way certain fabrics carry warmth inside them. Rather than bouncing it back, the pearl white trim at the collar and sleeves was precise and unembellished. The deep blue accent sash was the exact shade of the persimmon tree's late autumn leaves before they fell. Bobby Joe looked at it for a long time, without touching it. Then, she looked at the inner hem. The seamstress had turned the lower section outward so she could see. There, hidden in the fold of the brocade, was the embroidery. The flower, the wave, the two barely touching hands. Stitched in thread, the exact color of the fabric itself. Invisible unless you were looking for it. Private, hers. "Nobody will see it there," Bobby Joe said. "You will," Park Ji-young said. The second dinner was larger. Minwoo had organized it. 30 people in the main hall. The chandelier lit fully for the first time in 2 years. The table set with the formal Kang service that was only brought out for significant occasions. Business partners. Family allies. The 3 elders and their wives. Raymond Cho positioned near the door, as always. Madame Kang at her customary seat at Minwoo's right, dressed in her dove-gray handbok, her jade pendant at her collarbone. Bobby Joe entered the main hall in the gold handbok. She did not pause in the doorway. She walked in at the pace she always walked. Deliberate, unhurried, the weight of the brocade falling cleanly with each step. The metallic thread caught the chandelier light and moved it through the room like something alive. No one spoke. Minwoo stood. He came to her at the center of the room, took her hand, and turned to face the assembled guests. He did not use a microphone. He did not raise his voice. "This is Bobby Joe Whitfield, my fiancé, the future Madame Kang." He let that settle. "Anyone who disrespects her, disrespects my choice. Anyone who disrespects my choice places themselves outside this house." It was not a threat. It was a fact. The people in that room knew the difference. Madame Kang's hands were flat on the table. She started to rise. Park Ji-young stood first. She was not a large woman. She did not speak loudly, but the room went still, the way rooms go still when someone stands who is never expected to need to. "I have dressed this family for 40 years, she said. "I dressed Madame Kang at her wedding. I dressed the wives of every elder in this room." She paused. The hanbok was not disgraced. It was honored. By a woman who understood the weight of every stitch she chose. The room held that sentence. Madame Kang did not sit, but she did not speak either. She stood with her hands flat on the table, and her jaw very tight, and the defense she had prepared. The language of tradition, of lineage, of what the Kang name meant, and who had the right to carry it, dissolved, because the woman who had given that tradition its authority in this room had just used it to say the opposite of everything. Madame Kang had claimed, "You cannot argue with your own weapon when it fires back at you." Minwoo turned to his mother. "You wanted her to cover herself in shame," he said, "so I dressed her in gold. And I made sure everyone who matters saw it." He did not wait for an answer. He led Bobby Joe to the seat at his left. The seat that had never had a designated occupant in the years she had worked this room. The seat that had always simply been the chair next to his. She sat down. She could feel the inner hem of the hanbok against her ankle. The hidden embroidery, the flower from her mother's yard, the wave she had crossed to arrive here, the two hands barely touching at the center. No one would see it. Everyone in that room would eventually understand it anyway. Madame Kang sat down. She looked at her hands. Dinner was served. The woman who had been called a disgrace was seated at the table, dressed in gold, in the house she had known longer than most of the people trying to keep her out of it. She did not need them to accept her tonight. She only needed to still be there in the morning. And she was. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever worked inside a world that refused to fully see you, giving everything you had to people who would have erased your name the moment it was convenient? Have you ever chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier? Not because you were afraid, but because you had already planted something and you were not going to let someone else stand in its shade? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, tradition, and the kind of love that refuses to make you invisible, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.